Reed Calloway stood in the center of conference room 14C, blue uniform wrinkled, the mop handle still in his left hand. Around the oval table, 6 national delegations watched in silence. And he spoke Arabic first, then Japanese, then Russian, each sentence precise, each one landing exactly where it needed to land. Diana Wren stood 2 steps away. The color had drained from her face, not from anger, but from the sudden, vertiginous understanding that the man who had mopped this hallway for 8 months, the man she had never once thought to ask about, was doing what 16 certified interpreters had failed to do. To understand how he got there, you have to go back to 7:03 that same morning. The call came in at 7:45. Diana Wren had been at her desk since 6:15. She was the CEO of the Vantage Group, a strategic consulting firm on North Wacker Drive in Chicago, and she had learned early in her career that the most important hours were the ones before anyone else arrived. This morning, however, the quiet had already been ruined by a staffing agency dispatch number on her phone and by her assistant knocking on the glass door at precisely the same moment. The interpreter had been in a collision on Interstate 90. Minor injuries. He would not be coming in. She set the phone on the desk and held it there with her palm flat. This was the 16th name on a list that had started with 16 names. The first 4 had scheduling conflicts. The 5th spoke Mandarin and Japanese, but not Arabic or Russian. The 6th had a family emergency. The 7th was excellent and unavailable until Thursday. Numbers 8 through 13 had not answered or had declined. The 14th confirmed at noon and went silent by 10 that evening. The 15th called at 6 in the morning with a fever of 102. And the 16th, the one she had chosen specifically because his credentials covered all 6 required languages, had just been sideswiped on the interstate. The summit began at 10 o'clock. Delegations had arrived from the UAE, Russia, Japan, South Korea, France, and Brazil. None of them spoke English at the level appropriate for high-stakes contractual negotiation. Not the liability structures, not the exit provisions, not the specific legal register that made the difference between an agreement that held and one that dissolved in arbitration. The contract was worth $2.4 billion. 9 months of preparation had gone into this single day. Clifton Marsh appeared in her doorway at 7:53. He was her chief operating officer, 48, well-dressed, composed in a way that had always signaled competence to her, and only recently had begun to signal something else she couldn't quite name. He folded his arms and leaned against the frame. "Postpone it," he said. "We can't risk an unvetted interpreter on a deal this size." "We're not postponing," Diana said. "Diana, 9 months, Clifton. Find someone. You have 2 hours. He looked at her without expression, then nodded once and left. She picked up the phone and worked through every remaining contact she had. Down the hall, on the same floor, Reed Calloway was pushing his cleaning cart past the supply closet at the east end of the corridor. He wore the building services uniform navy pants, a collared shirt with the maintenance logo on the chest, and had one wireless earbud in, through which he was listening to a recorded lecture in Farsi on the philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. The translation was imperfect. He noticed each error the way a musician notices a flat note, not consciously at first, just as a small wrongness in the texture of something that should be smooth. His phone buzzed. He stopped the cart and read the message. It was from Maisie, sent from the school tablet she was supposed to use only for homework. "Asterisk, Dad. Today is the spelling test. You will pick me up at 3 o'clock, right? I spelled necessary 11 times last night. Asterisk." He typed back, "Asterisk, I know. 3 o'clock. You're going to get every single one. Asterisk." He put the phone away, replaced the earbud, and pushed the cart forward. The Farsi lecture resumed. He caught another translation error in the second sentence and let it go. Reed had been cleaning the 14th floor of the Vantage Group building for 11 months, and he knew its rhythms the way he knew most things, not from effort, but from proximity and attention. He knew which tiles near the elevator collected the most foot traffic dust by midweek. He knew that the executive offices filled between 8:15 and 8:40, that the conference room stayed empty until 9, and that the hallway outside room 14C was quietest at 7:50, which was when he usually mopped it. He was 41 years old. Before the cleaning job, he had spent 14 years as a senior interpreter with the United States Department of State. He spoke 9 languages, not as a list of credentials, but as a set of tools he had spent his entire adult life sharpening. He had sat behind glass panels in Geneva, in Tokyo, in Riyadh, translating the words of ministers and trade representatives. He had been in rooms when agreements nearly failed and had been the one to catch the error that saved them. He had never been thanked by name. He had left all of it in April of 2021, 6 weeks after Claire's funeral. Not because the work had lost its meaning, because Maisie was 7 and had no one else to be at the school gate by 3 o'clock. At 8:17, Diana came down the hallway with her phone pressed to her ear and her mind somewhere ahead of her body. She was talking to someone at the staffing agency. Her voice controlled and compressed the register of a person who has not yet raised her voice, but has identified exactly where the line is. She did not see the cleaning bucket until her foot caught it. Water spread across the tile in a wide arc, reaching the baseboard on one side and the edge of Reed's cart on the other. Diana looked down at the spill. Then she looked briefly at Reed, a flat, passing look, the kind you give a piece of furniture you've walked into and kept moving. She did not break her sentence. Reed knelt. He set the bucket upright, took the extra towel from the lower shelf of his cart, and laid it across the water. He did this without expression, without watching her go, without any gesture that suggested he had expected anything different, because he hadn't. From the elevator vestibule, Nora Sills watched. Nora was the head of human resources for the Vantage Group and one of the very few people in the building who had read Reed Calloway's complete employment file before countersigning it. She knew exactly who he was. She had agreed to a building services classification for him, flexible scheduling, no disclosure because he had asked quietly and given a reason she found sufficient. She was a person who kept her word. She watched Diana's back disappear around the corner. She looked at Reed, who was repositioning the cart with the same steadiness he brought to everything. He didn't look up. She held still for a moment, then walked to her office and closed the door. Reed replaced the damp towel, moved to the supply closet at the corridor's east end, and opened the door. On the shelf between the cleaning solution and a box of replacement mop heads sat a small brown notebook, narrow, worn at the spine, its cover darkened with years of handling. Inside, in his own handwriting, were columns of vocabulary, idioms, legal terms, and cultural notes in 9 languages. He had started it in his first year at the State Department and carried it through 11 countries. He did not open it. He looked at it for a moment the way you look at something that once defined, you then closed the supply closet and went back to work. The fluorescent light above the shelf flickered once. The hallway was quiet, and somewhere behind a glass door on this same floor, 16 names on a list had all run out. By 9:48, the answer was still no one. Diana had made 7 additional calls. Nora had worked 2 separate networks. The agency had escalated to their premium roster and returned empty. 1 candidate was certified but covered only 4 of the 6 languages. Another arrived by video call from New York, reviewed the summit scope, and said with genuine regret that he was not qualified to handle Arabic commercial law at this level. A third had been available 2 days ago. Diana walked into conference room 14C at 9:51, with her face arranged in the expression she used for impossible situations present, controlled, giving nothing away. The delegates had already taken their seats around the oval table. Khalid al-Mansouri from the UAE sat to her left, a tall man in a white dishdasha with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to waiting but not to being kept waiting. Beside him sat Alexei Volkov from Russia, silver-haired and watchful. Then Hiroshi Hayashi from Japan, Sujin Park from South Korea, Laurent Moreau from France, and Roberto Caldas from Brazil. 6 flags stood against the interior wall. The room looked exactly as it was supposed to look. Everything else was wrong. Clifton Marsh had positioned himself in the chair nearest the door, legs crossed, hands folded in his lap. He was wearing the expression of a man who had told someone that something would go wrong and was now waiting for the acknowledgement. At 9:53, the door behind Diana opened. Reed Calloway came through it, pushing his cart. The cleaning schedule had him servicing the corridor outside 14C between 9:50 and 10 to 10. He parked the cart against the wall to the right of the door, pulled the dry mop from its rack, and began working the section of hallway directly adjacent to the entrance. He didn't look through the glass. Khalid al-Mansouri rose from his chair. He walked out of the conference room into the corridor and spoke to Reed in Arabic. He was not being rude. He simply assumed that a man in a building services uniform, standing in a hallway, was a building services employee who could be asked a question. "Brother," he said in the Gulf dialect, the cadence of Abu Dhabi in his vowels, "is there still sparkling water, or only still?" Reed answered in the same dialect without pausing. without any adjustment in his posture or expression. Still only, I'm afraid. I'll have someone bring up sparkling within 15 minutes if you'd like, it's no trouble. Al-Mansuri went completely still. He looked at Reed, the blue uniform, the mop handle, the name badge reading R. Calloway in block letters. He looked at him again in a different way. Then he asked a second question, and this one was not about water. It was about the confidentiality provisions in the draft contract's third addendum a point his legal team had flagged, phrased in a register of formal Arabic that required not just language fluency, but legal and cultural context that most interpreters in Chicago would not have encountered outside of a textbook. Reed answered it cleanly, precisely, in the correct register, with the correct legal framing. He did not volunteer an opinion. He simply made the ambiguity visible in a way that hadn't been visible before. Diana was in the doorway. She had heard the Arabic from inside the room, had stood up without quite deciding to, and now she was standing in the doorframe looking at the two of them. Her face was doing something it almost never did, going completely still while the rest of her worked very fast. What she started. Then, what did you just say to him? Reed looked at her. Al-Mansuri looked at her. She stood between the conference room and the hallway, and the flags were visible behind her, and the silence in the room was the kind that forms around something no one has found the words for yet. I answered his question, Reed said, quietly. In English? Diana took 2 steps into the hallway and lowered her voice. What languages do you speak? Reed was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, measuring. There was a difference, and it was one she recognized. Arabic, he said, Farsi, Russian, Japanese, Korean, French, Spanish, Mandarin, a pause, and English. She looked at him. He was still holding the mop handle in his right hand. A cleaning glove hung from his left. His uniform had been on since before 6 in the morning. He looked exactly like what the badge said he was, and he had just listed 9 languages the way another person might list the cities they'd lived in without performance, without waiting to see what impression it made. Why are you working here? She asked. Because I need to be somewhere at 3 o'clock to pick up my daughter. He said it without apology and without explanation, just the fact of it, plain and complete. She waited a beat to see if there was more. There wasn't. Clifton Marsh appeared at her shoulder. He had followed the sound of the exchange from his seat near the door, and he now stood with his arms slightly away from his body, the posture of someone who has already decided the answer and is waiting for the room to catch up. Diana, he said, you can't be serious. She didn't look at him. She was looking at Reed, running the geometry of the situation, the 10 o'clock start time, the 6 delegations already seated inside, the $2.4 billion, and this man in front of her, who had just spoken Gulf Arabic to the UAE's senior delegate, as naturally as if he'd been doing it his whole life, which, she was beginning to understand, he had. Can you do this? She asked. How long? Reed said. 4 hours, maybe a little more. I need to be done at 3. You'll be done at 3. Reed looked at her for one more second. Then he pulled off the cleaning glove and set it on the cart. He leaned the mop against the wall. He took a breath that was not dramatic, just the breath of someone deciding something, and walked through the conference room door. Clifton said something else. Diana did not hear it. Inside 14C, Reed took the seat at the interpreter station, a chair and a small desk positioned to the right of the head of the table, angled so he could see both Diana and the assembled delegates. The 6 delegations looked at him. He was aware of the assessment happening in real time, the blue uniform, the name badge, the complete absence of anything that suggested he belonged in this room in this capacity. He let the assessment happen. He had learned a long time ago that how people decided to see you in the first moment was rarely what mattered in the end. Hiroshi Hayashi leaned slightly forward and spoke quietly to the man beside him in Japanese. The words were a measured observation. Asterisk. They appear to have made an unconventional choice. Asterisk. Reed answered in Japanese. Standard Tokyo register, unhurried, addressed directly to Hayashi. I understand that this is not what any of you expected this morning. I want you to know that I'll give you an accurate rendering of everything said in this room, every word, every nuance. That's what I'm here for. Hayashi studied him for a long moment. The room was very quiet. Then the Japanese delegate inclined his head, a small, deliberate bow that carried the specific meaning of, proceed. Diana looked at the clock on the wall. 9:59. She looked at the 6 delegations, then at Reed, then at the flags behind him, and she said, in a voice that was steadier than she felt, "Let's begin." The session began at 10 o'clock, 4 minutes behind schedule. Reed worked from the interpreter's station without notes. He had never used notes during a live session. The State Department had trained him early that a page between you and the speaker created a half-second delay that compounded across hours into something that felt, to everyone in the room, like a lack of presence. He listened to each speaker completely before rendering, which was not how every interpreter worked, but was how he worked because meaning lived in full sentences, not fragments, and a complete thought translated differently than a partial one. The first 20 minutes were technical, introductory statements, firm positions, the kind of opening language that is really just each party saying, in their most formal register, that they are serious. Reed moved between the 6 languages without announcement, directing each translation to the appropriate delegate with a slight shift in his posture. The delegates began to track his movements automatically, the way an audience tracks a conductor. Diana watched from the head of the table. She was not watching Reed. She was watching the delegates watch Reed, watching the specific quality of attention they brought to him, the way they leaned in fractionally when he spoke their language, the way the Korean representative uncrossed her arms after the first 20 minutes, without appearing to notice she had done it. The room had changed. Not because the positions had changed, but because for the first time since 9:51, the people in it could actually hear each other. She breathed. Quietly, without drawing attention to it, but she breathed. Reed translated Moreau's third point from French into Japanese and Russian simultaneously, or nearly so, a compression of 2 separate renders that he had developed over years of working rooms with multiple listener groups. He caught the precise irony in Moreau's phrasing, which in French read as wit but in Japanese would have registered as confrontation, and he smoothed it, not altering the substance, but adjusting the register so that what Hayashi heard was the point rather than the edge. Hayashi responded. His response was measured, precise, and agreeable in a way it might not have been 5 minutes earlier. Clifton Marsh stood in the hallway outside the conference room's glass wall. He had his phone to his ear, his body angled away from the door, his free hand in his jacket pocket. His expression was the expression of a person recalculating, which he did well. He was good at recalculating, at identifying what had changed and adjusting his position accordingly. He spoke in a voice low enough that the words were inaudible through the glass. Nora Sills came down the corridor on her way back from the 11th floor. She passed within 10 feet of Clifton and heard one phrase before he registered her presence and stepped further from the door. Asterisk, find out who he is, and find out fast. Asterisk. She kept walking. She went to her office on the far end of the 14th floor, unlocked the left-hand file drawer, and pulled out a gray folder. She knew exactly what was in it. She read the first 2 pages, confirming what she already knew, then set it on the corner of her desk where she could reach it quickly and went back to her regular work. Inside 14C, Reed finished the Korean representative's opening position and rendered it into English for the record, then into Japanese and French. The room was moving now. Not easily, nothing this size moved easily, but with a logic that had been absent an hour ago. Point raised, position heard, response offered. The sequence that negotiations require before anything real can happen. By 11:30, the room had begun to believe it. The session broke at 12:30. Diana crossed to the credenza, poured coffee from the carafe, and carried a second cup to where Reed stood near the window. She held it out. He took it. Neither of them made anything of it. It was just coffee, but it was the first thing she had ever given him, and they both knew it without saying so. They stood side by side looking down at Chicago. The river was just visible from this angle, a gray-green line through the distance, and the bridge crossings caught the winter light. The city went on doing what it did, indifferent to everything happening on the 14th floor of one of its taller buildings. "Where did you learn all of it?" Diana asked. "Work," he said. "What kind of work?" He looked out the window. Translation. She waited. He didn't add anything. She looked down at his left hand, wrapped around the paper cup. He wore a wedding ring, plain gold, narrowed and worn in the specific way that takes years, not months. She looked at it for only a moment. He noticed. She could tell by the way he didn't move the hand, didn't shift it or adjust or tuck it away. He simply let her see it and didn't explain it. "How old is your daughter?" she asked. 9. "What's her name?" "Maisie." Something changed in his face when he said it, a slight softening at the corner of his mouth, a shift behind the eyes. The careful steadiness he maintained through everything else gave way, for just a moment, to something unguarded. It was the first real expression she had seen from him in 4 hours, not the interpreter's controlled attentiveness, not the quiet patience of a man accustomed to being overlooked, but something that belonged only to him. A father saying his daughter's name. Diana looked at him, this man in a wrinkled uniform, holding a paper coffee cup. With the ring of a life she knew nothing about worn smooth on his left hand, and felt something she recognized but could not immediately find a word for. Not sympathy, something less managed than that. The specific sensation of a person coming into focus. She almost asked about the ring, about 2021, about what had happened to the work that had required 9 languages across 11 countries, and why the answer to all of it was a cleaning cart on the 14th floor of a building he clearly could have walked into as something else entirely. She almost asked because she wanted to know, and she was a person who asked questions when she wanted to know things. She didn't ask. She looked back out the window instead. The river turned at the bend near the merchandise mart and disappeared behind a building. Somewhere below, the city went on at its usual speed. She spent last night studying for a spelling test, Reed said. Diana looked at him. She texted me about it this morning. He almost smiled. 11 times. She practiced the word necessary. 11 times. Did she get it right? She always gets it right. He said it the way people say things they know to be true, without emphasis, without performance. Just the fact of it. Diana nodded once and looked back at the window. The break was running out. In 4 minutes she would have to go back to the table, pick up the threads of the most consequential negotiation of the quarter, and hold them all together through the afternoon. She was aware of all of this in precise detail. She was also aware that she did not want to stop standing at this window. Thank you, she said quietly, for the coffee, for the room, for being someone she now, inexplicably, wanted to know more about. She let the single phrase cover all of it. Reed nodded. They turned and walked back toward the table. Clifton Marsh came back into the room with the delegates. He had a sheet of paper in his hand, folded once. He placed himself at Diana's elbow before she could reach her chair, and he held the paper at chest height with the particular deliberateness of someone who has timed an entrance. You need to see this, he said. Quietly, but not quietly enough to be private. Diana looked at him. The session is resuming. This first. She took the paper. It was a printout from the Building Services Human Resources database, Reed Calloway, Facility Services Grade B, hired 11 months prior. No registered professional certifications on file. No verified academic credentials in the building system. Contact. Standard Labor Placement Agency. Clifton's voice was controlled but projected, and the room was not large. We are in the final stages of a $2.4 billion negotiation. Our interpreter is a janitor, Grade B, with no credentials on record. He paused for the precise length of a pause that is calculated to land. If one word is mistranslated in the liability provisions, one word we could face consequences that don't survive arbitration. Volkov had looked up. Hayashi's hands had stilled on the table. Al-Mansuri was watching Clifton with the flat attention of a man who has seen this kind of maneuver in many languages and knows exactly what it is. Diana said nothing. Clifton pressed. I think we owe it to these delegates to. The door opened. Nora Sills walked in. She was not a person who announced herself. She crossed directly to the table and set a gray folder in front of Diana with the quiet efficiency of someone delivering a document that has been ready for some time. Mr. Marsh should read this first, she said. Diana opened the folder. The first page was a Department of State letterhead. Below it, a career summary. Reed Allen Calloway. 14 years of continuous service, Office of Language Services. Senior Interpreter Classification, effective 2012. Lead assignment, G7 Ministerial Summit, Geneva, 2014. Senior Language Officer, Multilateral Trade Proceedings, Tokyo, 2015. Chief Interpreter, Bilateral Summit Support, Riyadh, 2018. Commendation, 2016. Commendation, 2019. A security clearance notation that Diana had seen the equivalent of on exactly one other document in her professional career. The final entry, in the standard departure field, asterisk date of separation, April 14th, 2021. Reason for departure. Personal, asterisk. The room was very quiet. Diana turned the page. There were copies of commendation letters, each one specific, each one describing a moment when a mistranslation had been caught, a misunderstanding prevented, a negotiation kept intact by precisely the skill that had been at work in this room since 10 o'clock that morning. She read them without expression, taking her time. Then she looked through the glass panel of the conference room door to where Reed stood in the corridor, waiting with his paper coffee cup. His uniform was still wrinkled. His name badge still said R. Calloway in block letters. He had not changed. The room's understanding of him had. She closed the folder. She looked at Clifton, who was looking at the table. She looked at Nora, who was already moving quietly toward the door. She looked at the delegates, who were looking at her. Asterisk. What happened in 2021? Asterisk, she thought. She would not ask it today, and possibly not tomorrow. But she would ask it. Not because it changed anything about this room or this afternoon. Because she had spent 8 months not asking him anything at all, and she had decided that was over. She set the folder aside, looked up at the room and said, in a voice that was entirely steady, "Let's continue." The afternoon session was the hardest. The preliminary statements and position building of the morning had cleared the easy ground. What remained was the contested terrain, the liability provisions, the exit clause durations, the language around breach and remedy that would determine what each party could actually do if the agreement stopped working. This was the kind of negotiation that required not just translation but judgment, because the words people used in these rooms were chosen precisely, and the gap between what was said and what was meant could cost more than anyone at the table had budgeted for. Al-Mansouri returned to the confidentiality addendum. His legal team had flagged it during the morning recess, and he came back to it now with the focused attention of a man who does not let contested language rest. He introduced his position in Arabic, and the phrase he used to frame the duration clause was an old one drawn from classical Islamic commercial tradition, the kind of expression that appeared in pre-modern contract texts and had a technical meaning in Hanbali jurisprudence that no longer mapped directly onto its modern usage. Reed translated the surrounding language. Then he paused, a deliberate pause, the half-second of a person making a decision, and added, in English, addressed to the room, "Mr. Al-Mansouri is using a term from classical Islamic commercial law. In its original context, the phrase describes an exit provision that is time-bound at the point of the second contract cycle, not the first. The practical meaning is that he's proposing a 90-day withdrawal window, not 30. That distinction will affect how the indemnity clause in Section 4 reads." The room went still. Diana looked at her general counsel, who was already pulling up the relevant language on his laptop. She looked at Al-Mansouri, who was watching Reed with an expression that was not surprise, it was recognition. The recognition of a person who has finally been heard the way they intended to be heard. She said quietly to her legal team, "Pull Section 4. We're adjusting the term." The revision took 22 minutes. It required 3 separate rounds of language review, one clarifying exchange in Korean about the indemnity cap, and a brief discussion in French between Moreau and Caldas about how the revised window affected their own exposure. Reed handled all of it. He worked without notes, without visible effort, with the particular economy of someone who has done this long enough that the performance of competence has been replaced by the thing itself. At 2:57, Reed looked at the clock on the wall. He didn't move or speak. His expression didn't change, but the angle of his attention shifted by a fraction toward the clock, then back to the table, and Diana caught it. She knew what it meant. She had known since this morning what 3 o'clock meant to him. She caught her general counsel's eye. "Final terms," she said. "Close it now." They closed it in 90 seconds. The last signature went down at 2:59. Reed was already on his feet, reaching under the chair for the gray jacket he had folded there before the session began. He put it on over the blue uniform shirt, and then he stood at the table for a moment. Hayashi spoke in Japanese, to Reed, and the words were not a formality. "Today I learned something about the nature of humility," he said. "Not yours, mine." Reed answered in Japanese. He smiled the same quiet expression from the window, the one that belonged to him rather than to the room, and he bowed his head once. Then he turned toward the door. Diana followed him into the hallway. "Reed." He stopped and turned. She had thought of 4 different things to say on the walk across the room. None of them were right. She said the simplest one. "Thank you." He looked at her. "Maisie's waiting," he said, and he walked to the elevator and was gone. She was at the 14th floor at 7 o'clock the next morning. Reed was already there. He was working the east corridor with the cart, moving in the same direction he had moved 212 times before. Diana stepped off the elevator, walked the length of the hallway, and stopped in front of him. He removed one earbud. She held out an envelope, white, unsealed, his name on the front in her own handwriting. Language consulting contract, she said. 3 days a week. Flexible schedule. You set the hours. He looked at the envelope but didn't take it right away. Why? He said. Because we need someone who can do what you did yesterday. He was quiet. A member of the morning cleaning crew came around the far corner of the hallway, registered the conversation, and discreetly reversed. Or is it because you feel sorry for me? He said. It was not an accusation. He asked it the way he asked everything directly, without theater, because he wanted the accurate answer. She considered it. She thought about a brown notebook worn smooth by 11 countries, a wedding ring gone thin with years, the way he had set his daughter's name at the window and let the steadiness drop for just a moment. Both, she said. If you want the truth. He took the envelope. He put it in the breast pocket of his uniform jacket without opening it. I'll read it tonight, after Maisie's in bed. What is she like? Diana asked. The question came before she had decided to ask it, which was unusual for her. Dinosaurs and math. She looked at him. There was something in those 3 words that sounded like a complete person, specific and real. A child with a backpack and opinions and a spelling test she had studied for 11 times. Diana felt it the same way she had felt it at the window the day before, when he had said the name Maisie and his face had changed. Okay, she said. Reed nodded once and went back to work. Diana took the elevator to 16 and did not look at her phone for the first 4 minutes of the ride. Clifton Marsh appeared before the board of directors the following week. He arrived composed. He left 90 minutes later with the look of a man who had spent years being careful and had finally discovered that careful was not the same as invisible. The internal investigation that began that afternoon uncovered a competing advisory arrangement Clifton had maintained for 3 years while serving as Vantage Group's chief operating officer. Client contacts cultivated, privately, contract language introduced quietly, favorable terms steered in directions that benefited a firm he was consulting for on the side. Diana had trusted him with the architecture of the company. He had used the access to build something parallel to it. The investigation was thorough. The list was long. The board vote was decisive. Nora Sills was appointed interim COO while the search for a permanent replacement was conducted. She accepted with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to everything and asked for no additional resources. She already knew where everything was. Diana signed the consulting agreement Reed had returned to her, countersigned in the margin beside his 3-day schedule, and had it filed with human resources. She did not make an announcement. She did not send a company-wide email. She simply arranged for a key card to be ready for him at security on Tuesday morning, with an office assignment on the 12th floor. She also left a note on top of the key card envelope. In her own handwriting, it said, * room 1207, window faces west, good light in the afternoon, *. She did not sign it. He would know. 6 weeks passed. Reed Calloway settled into a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday schedule 8 in the morning until 2:45, which left him 15 minutes to reach the car and cross the 4 blocks to Maisie's school. His office was room 1207, west-facing, with good afternoon light exactly as the note had said. The brown notebook sat open on the corner of the desk. He still knew the names of every person on the morning building services rotation. Some things a person doesn't give up just because the title changes. On a Friday afternoon in early March, Maisie Calloway got off the school shuttle 2 stops early and walked into the lobby of the Vantage Group building. She knew it was the tall glass one, and she knew her father's office was on 12, so she pressed 12. The elevator opened onto an empty hallway. She turned left and came around the corner directly into Diana Wren. Diana was standing in the corridor with a coffee cup. In front of her stood a 9-year-old girl with a green dinosaur backpack and a ponytail partly loose from its elastic, looking up at her with the complete, uncomplicated directness of a child who has been made to feel safe in the world by at least one person. Are you my dad's boss? The girl said. Diana looked at her. Somewhat, she said. He told me you were smart. Down the hall, Reed had appeared in the doorway of 1207 with the expression of a parent who is simultaneously proud and mortified. He said that? Diana asked. I said you were good at negotiation, Reed offered from the hall. It's similar, Diana said. Maisie considered this and found it acceptable. She reached into her backpack and produced a sheet of paper, a spelling test, graded and returned, with 100 written at the top in red. She held it out to Diana. "Dad says you like it when people do their work right," she said. Diana took the test. 20 words, all correct. Asterisk necessary. Accommodate. Privilege. Occurrence. Asterisk. The handwriting was careful and slightly uneven, and entirely 9 years old. She held on to it. Reed came down the hall and put his hand on Maisie's shoulder. The girl leaned back into him without thinking, the way children lean against the people they are most certain of. "Ready?" he said. She saw it, Maisie told him, meaning the score. "I see it," Diana said. Maisie adjusted her backpack straps and turned toward the elevator. Reed followed. Diana stayed where she was and watched them go, the man with his hand on his daughter's shoulder, the girl describing something at speed, the elevator opening and closing behind them. The hallway was quiet. Diana looked down at the spelling test. 100, in red. Maisie's name at the top, printed carefully. She did not put it down. She stood in the afternoon light through the west window the light Reed had described, in 3 words on a note she had not signed, as good in the afternoon. She had spent 8 months walking past a man she had never asked about. She thought she would think about that for a while. She stayed where she was. For the first time in a long time, there was nowhere else she needed to be.